President Reagan called the disaster at Cape Canaveral a national tragedy, expressed the country's sympathy to the families of the Challenger's 7 crew members, and he had this special message.
I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye, and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
Because of what happened today, the President has canceled his State of the Union message, which was scheduled for this evening. He will deliver it next week. Bill?
When we come back, we'll have more on the tragedy of Space Shuttle Challenger right after this.
If you love the taste...
Okay. President Reagan, on the advice of the Republican leaders of both Senate and House, decided to postpone tonight's State of the Union speech until next Tuesday. The President, of course, has been a strong supporter of the space program. In fact, during his 1984 re-election campaign, Mr. Reagan decided that one of the crew members on today's ill-fated mission was to be a teacher.
I'm directing NASA to begin a search in all of our elementary and secondary schools and to choose as the first citizen passenger in the history of our space program, one of America's finest, a teacher.
Like so many other places, Washington came to a virtual halt as news of the tragedy broke. The House of Representatives paused for a moment of silence for the shuttle crew. The Senate did the same. White House spokesman Larry Speaks announced that President Reagan's State of the Union address will be pushed back to next Tuesday.
The President, like all Americans, watched this on television, and he felt very keenly the emotion that must be felt by the families of those down there and that had to watch this event in person, and very keenly what the American people must be feeling. He consulted with the congressional leadership, and the consensus opinion of the executive and the legislative branch was that it was appropriate to postpone.
Many members of the Congress have ties to the space program. None more so than Senator John Glenn, one of the original 7 Mercury astronauts, the men immortalized in the book and the film The Right Stuff.
You accept risks, but you feel that the risks are worth it for the country and the importance of what you're doing. And you're willing to take those risks. And that's the way we looked at it back then. That's the way I'm sure all of the current group of astronauts looks at it.
The very first civilian in space was Senator Jake Garn, who got his training for his mission from the co-pilot of today's mission. And he knew most of the others, too.
And I knew Kristen McAuliffe the least of them because she wasn't there. Greg Jarvis, I trained with. Dick Scobie, I knew. Mike Smith was my mother hen, and you go on Azuka, flew in January last year when I was flying.
Vice President Bush was in his office when he heard the news.
Terrible tragedy.
Bush left Washington this afternoon for Cape Canaveral. He and Senator John Glenn will go there to express the nation's sorrow for the tragedy of today.
It was 19 years ago yesterday when an on-pad test killed 3 astronauts trapped in a capsule fire atop the Apollo 1. That accident intensified NASA's safety concerns. Then today, everybody's unstated fear happened. It all began years ago.
Space is there, and the moon and the planets are there, and new hopes for knowledge and peace are there. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked.
Dangerous indeed, the idea of putting a human being on top of the still primitive rockets used in the early days of spaceflight, developed from the Vengeance rockets of Hitler, whose V-2 killed thousands. The basic tools of space exploration were built by, at first, teams led by German engineers like Werner von Braun.
We knew that we had created a new means of warfare, and the question as to what nation, to what victorious nation we are willing to entrust this brainchild of ours was a moral decision more than anything else.
But the race to space was begun by the Soviets. Sputnik began beeping from space on October 4, 1957. A new era. Our first response to Sputnik, fear.
Earth satellites, in themselves, have no direct present effect upon the nation's security. However, there is real military significance to these launchings.
4 months later, January 1958, the first American satellite, Explorer, it went into Earth orbit, and the space race was on. Both the U.S. and USSR launching space probes and satellites, some of which contained animals. By the middle of 1960, the Soviets had managed to put animals in space and bring them back alive. That set the stage for manned flight. It was April 12, 1961. Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space. He made one orbit around the globe, a flight of 1 hour, 48 minutes. A translator reports his reaction.
I saw for the first time the shape of the Earth. I could see continents, islands, great rivers. My feelings I could express in one word, joy.
Space was now a contest. Cosmonauts versus astronauts.
These, ladies and gentlemen, are the nation's Mercury astronauts.
The U.S., limited by its smaller rockets, the Mercury Redstone, could only counter by sending Alan Shepard into a suborbital flight that lasted a little over 15 minutes. In those days, recovery was at sea, aircraft carriers waiting in the drop zone, while observers held their breath, helicopters plucking capsules from the waves. We lost one capsule that way, and almost an astronaut. But by February 1962, the U.S. was ready for a manned orbital flight. John Glenn made it. The U.S. was getting confident.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
And it would happen. But first, years of probes and preparation. Orbital flights had become almost routine. So had spacewalks. The first woman, Valentina Tereshkova. She flew in 1963. An unmanned probe, Ranger 7, landed on the moon and sent back pictures. The Gemini program practiced docking maneuvers. The Apollo program, which would take us to the moon, began with a disaster, a fire which killed 3 astronauts. In 1969, Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins, they got to the moon.
Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Rocket.
Armstrong taking that first big step.
That's one small step for man. One giant leap for mankind.
There were other lunar landings, then an emphasis on space stations, and of course the probe of distant planets. But for this country, the concentration seemed to be the Shuttle program.
Children in a school in Oakland, New Jersey were planning their own...